All right, I'm excited to have this conversation. I'm here with Rippin Sindher, who's the director of a short doc titled Seva. For reals, thank you for making this film as a brown boy who grew up, especially post 9/11, and trying to identify and define and figure himself out in this crazy world. This film means a lot to me, but more importantly, thank you for being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But first, I don't know you, so I'd just love to hear your backstory. Before you made this short doc, what were you doing and how did you get here? And then what inspired you to make this film?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I'm Rippin, and I grew up in a small farm town, a raisin farm town in Central California. And I did have big girl dreams. I just never knew that I was going to get into filmmaking until after I went to UCLA and started toying with the idea, and then crossed that cultural boundary line and said,
brown person making film is a challenging, huge threshold to cross, especially within the community and the family. So I just want to go even further if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was, my parents were always supportive, but you're right. It's not only hard as a brown person, but add in there being a female, and kind of having traditional, creations of what you're going to do. And so after I was done with UCLA, I thought I was going to go to graduate school. Took a year and said, no, maybe I don't want to do that. Traveled, found myself a little bit, but I kept coming back to story. And I think as a young person, I was always so passionate about story and the arts, but sadly it was compartmentalized as being a hobby, and not really a career option. And so I struggled with that for a really long time. And then Remoy, I got into doing an assistant job at the Directors Guild, and I spent 10 years there. I spent 10 years there, and I was building up into the professional career of management. But what that did for me was changed everything. I was writing stories on the side, but I was getting access to who these filmmakers were, whether it was narrative TV, feature, or documentaries. And that became my film school. It became my best film school while I was making money as a living, and then channeling that money into my own projects. And most of them happened to be narrative, but then I got into being able to make this documentary with the support of my hometown and the community behind that.
No, I love that backstory. And I mean, yes, you went to UCLA, went to university, but it was that life experience within the position that really was almost a better education, or a more ideal apt education, because as things are constantly changing and changing very fast in our contemporary times, it gave you the opportunity to see how the industry was changing and how the work was changing and what the work actually looked like. Specifically for this short doc, we see a beautiful poster behind you. Shout out to that poster. Film's titled Seva, and the film's in a way is defining what Seva means, and it means it has it can be interpreted, or it has a broad interpretation, and you constantly are rehearing that from a multitude of voices within the film. But not only is it defining what that means, but it's defining what that means particularly within the Sikh community, who's gone through a lot of tragedy over the last 20 years, especially at Oak Creek. But in your own words, can you kind of share what the film is and what Seva means?
Yeah, absolutely. Seva to me really means not only a selfless service that you are doing, but you are doing it with the intention of creating a better humanity, because you're not wanting anything in return. And it was a principle that I really grew into as a child. My parents would take me to the local temple and say, go clean the shoes, go make the rotis, and go help in that langar hall. And when that's created as your foundation, you operate through the world as, okay, what can I do to serve? If someone needs help, how can I help them? And that became the foundation for this film. And the poster is actually done by an incredible South Asian brown woman. And it actually is the it was important even in showing what the definition of Seva means through the poster of like giving, but how does that translate in a country where there's so much bloodshed and not acceptance of who you are? And so that was the theme of what I personally wanted to explore.
Yo, like real talk, it's a well-made film in the sense like it is balanced AF and it is lean. It is like roughly 16 minutes, 17 minutes, maybe a little bit less, right? But it covers a lot of spectrum and it never feels heavy-handed. It feels like the transitions from themes and story is as seamless as possible. But you know, you're from the community, and it's hard when you're writing or telling any sort of story from the community to not be like, yo, I want to tell everything. And I'm really close to this and every little thing means something to me. Or on the opposite, everything I already know. So why do I need to explain it to somebody else? Like everybody already knows it, right? Those are challenges. So I guess I want to talk to you about making a film from a community, especially a film that has like this social justice and kind of reconciliation effect or potential effect. What was the process like making it so deeply rooted in the community, and what were some of the things that were very helpful to make it a film that could connect to a larger audience?
I was so lucky to apply for this Bank of America grant that was being given in my hometown. And it was 10 recipients, and it was having to do with something community-based, right? So I was sitting on some footage that I had shot in India when I went to the temple, where there's 100,000 meals being served every single day, where strangers come from around the world and they're serving. So I was sitting on that footage, and I always knew I wanted to do something with it, but I was always kind of waiting for the right time because it was it was so close to me, that and the hate crime that had happened in Oak Creek. And so when this grant came around, I think that was the push. That was like the get out of your comfort zone and go do this documentary, because this is the time to do it. And so the documentary was actually, the grant was given to do like a short 5-minute piece, but I knew that I wanted to make this a bigger story. And so in order to do that, I was filming things at the time with that. And then it was like a 2-year process to make 15 minutes, right? And to get the interviews and get the live footage on the ground of the different parades that were happening and make this story. And the thing is, we would go to the cutting board, and I had an incredible sister friend, story producer, editor, confidant, Kenzie Woodrow, and we would put the pieces together and say, I don't know, it's not the story we want to tell. Like it was either heavier on the fundamentals of Seva, or it was heavier on the hate crimes and faith-based crime, community crimes that were happening. And so finding that balance, I think what we had going for us was I really brought the perspective of being someone who had come from the religion and is so close to the subject matters. And then we had Kenzie, who was bringing that balanced point of view of saying, if I was an audience member, how am I looking at this? I know nothing about Six. I know nothing about Seva. But what I do know is that when atrocity happens to a community, it changes everything. So that's really how that all came full circle.
Real talk, like there can be some challenge with that in the sense, or there may be some pushback from other people about that, being like letting an outsider into the process. And what is that like? You know, how could you do that? Or like, that's not authentic enough, and so on and so forth. How do you speak to that? Or was there any challenge there, or was it just completely organic? And how was like the trust formed in telling such an intimate story?
I think trust is such a big factor in all of this, especially in documentaries. I feel like I was pushed into spaces where people were being so vulnerable with me and being so honest about their truth or what they stood for, and to protect that and to say, yes, I am one of you. I am in this community, but also I want to give you the space that you need to be in your existence for this film, right? And then when I found Kenzie, we've had a longstanding friendship, and she's the kind of storyteller that it was seamless. It just fit like this. And I think when you see and you have that common ground of what is that story you want to tell, and she was very clear. She said, Rippin, you are the lead on this. Like, this is the story. And I'm here to help and support, but also offer the perspective of someone giving you that balanced point of view. And she just took this film. I don't think that I could have made this with the pieces that I had, because she brought so much to it. And then we had to think outside of the box to really portray the timeline of different hate crimes that were happening, that was going to bridge everything that happened from 2011 into to the hate crime that happened in Oak Creek.
I want to get to that, but you mentioned a lot of voices, and I think it's really interesting. Like, I can't emphasize it enough. Like, there's so much balance in the film, and there's a lot of voices in the film, right? And like, there's a lot of people talking, and there's a lot of people giving a little bit more of nuance and character and color to what Seva means. And so my question is like, what was the process there, and how did that happen? And not like that, those are general broad questions, but like more specifically, like, how did you find the voices? How did you land on what voices to choose? Was there like a logic to it, or like a strategy, or was it more organic? Can you talk about that, por favor?
Yes. I feel like with documentaries, it's like you plant one seed and then it just grows and it grows and it grows. And I was so lucky to get so many different people on board with this. So when it started, I knew that I wanted, and to your point, there were so many different voices, and it was unconventional for me to do a documentary where there's not one lead, singular voice kind of carrying us through per se, because there were so many different working elements to it. So I knew that I wanted to get the biggest organization involved in the Central California first, which was the Jakara movement. And Nandip Singh, who was this really established figure, he's a professor, he's a scholar, he's very well studied in the religion, in the practice of Seva, but also he's done incredible organizing work and has really spearheaded what it means to be involved in the community and to show up for all communities. So I knew that he was going to be one of the biggest pieces to it. And then we were going to branch around that. And because the grant had started in the Central California area, which is home to one of the biggest populations of the Sikh community, that really trickled into him giving me access to a couple of subjects that were on the ground in Oak Creek when the hate crime happened. And then that led to the Sikh Coalition, which is at the forefront of making change and policy changes for the community. And so it was just this effect of, I have this one piece, and how can I get these other folks involved? And there were a lot of additional interviews that we did too. And with 15 minutes and trying to keep it as tight as you possibly can, it just didn't work. But it was like Pandora's box. I was opening one thing, I was like, oh my goodness, this person is doing this. That's incredible. Whoa. I didn't even know. I think that's the beauty of film. I didn't even know that I was even learning in the process of doing this. I was learning about my own people in this community that were doing the work that I just hadn't seen. I hadn't come across it in that same way. So through storytelling and through getting access to them, I was learning about what they were doing. And that was inspiring on all levels.
I want to get to that, because that's like I love that. Like, as creators and storytellers, or even in American life, it's like expected that you do this thing and you know what you're doing, and you do it and la, la, la. But in reality, you're just constantly learning and adapting and like growing and changing, which is so powerful. But just back to the previous question, like, real talk, 2 years, a lot of voices, that's a lot of tape, that's a lot of transcriptions, or trying to transcribe because it costs money to get transcriptions done. I guess just like, were there any major challenges there? Or like, what was the process even for like drilling it down?
Oh yeah. There are definitely challenges. There's so many challenges, right? Especially when you have your heart and you have this much money and you have this big of a heart, and you're like, how do I make this thing that I see it in my head? I see it in my head. And then it becomes about there aren't as many resources that I need at this given time in my life to make this movie the way that I want to make it, right? And so those become the limiting factors. And then it becomes about how do I actually work through that? And I joke with my brother, I call him the studio. I'm like, you're giving me practice. But I basically do a couple of my first screenings with him. And I say, I'm too close to the material and you need to tell me, how is this sitting with you? You know, and he'll be really honest, like, this is just too loose. This is too tight. And then I go into my, I was so lucky to have Derek Doneen. I don't know if you know him, an incredible documentarian with the film. That was at Sundance, and just people that have been there before. I reached out to them and I said, look, these are all of the pieces. This is where it is. How is this landing with you? You're more experienced than I am when it comes to documentary. So how can I lean into your knowledge? And they were just so giving of what pieces needed to be a little bit more tightened. And then ultimately sitting with what was the story that I wanted to tell. And that was finding the balance for those things. I hope that answers.
No, and I think that's what's really incredible, especially about the documentary community. I mean, being a person of color, being a brown person, it can be challenging times to find yourself, to feel overwhelmed with like entering communities that you may not feel there may be the gatekeepers for, but the documentary community especially is very generous and very forthcoming, and like it's a legit community, no matter where in the country or where in the world you are. And it's really incredible to hear that support was available and given, especially for like filmmakers, aspiring filmmakers, or filmmakers who don't even know they're filmmakers yet. It's always good to have that encouragement to ask and to reach out and to, it is a process, right? And story and edits and coming together to the final story is a labor of love, but it's a labor of love from a community. And I think
I think it stretches you in ways to unwire how your relationship with story, because you're dealing with real humans and their experiences, and adding to, the idea of trust, you're having to adapt on the fly. And so there was no fear. It was like, there was fear in the sense that like, I have to be sensitive to what they're doing, but no fear in terms of, if you have to be this close with someone and have a camera in between you and still feel that human connection and be really emotionally intelligent to that. And so I just wanted to speak on that for a second, because you really have to be a go-getter in terms of, I got to pick up the camera. I can't wait for this shot to happen. It's not like you're staging something to happen. I'm telling an honest story from this human's perspective. And how do I create space for that?
One thing I really loved about your film, and there's one particular question that we hit upon earlier, but there's a lot of symbols in your film. And like, a lot of times we see stories, we engage with anything, and we're unconsciously like, we see a symbol, we may have an interpretation or we may not, right? But I want to talk about your film and Seva specifically, and talk about the symbols within the film, like what is a gurdwara, or like even like a turban, like all these symbols of whether it's othering or outsider, or the opposite, like where these symbols for the community are actually a symbol of inclusion and inclusivity. Was there like a thought around the idea of symbols and these being symbols and how they would affect particular audience members?
There was definitely thought about, what did I want to show in terms of like the experiences that I have had that exist within this world. And I wanted to show, for me, the innocence of children is always really key. And I think because they come into this world wanting to be accepted, especially, and then they have this whole journey of how do I fit in or not. And so there's a couple of shots, especially with the guttis on, which is a form of the turban for young boys and girls. But to see that, it was important to highlight this and to humanize Because sometimes our light is so dimmed about, oh, well, that's the turban, or that's one way of being a Sikh, or one way of being Punjabi, one way of being a brown person, and it's not. And so I really wanted to, in order to show the deep contrast of what that looked like, but keep it grounded, it was important to me. What does that look like? Those were my memories, even as a child, of being in dining halls, in the kitchens, and serving. What does that look like? The magnitude of the food that is being created all the time to welcome all people. And I just think that going into some of those shots of like, what is this place that is sacred, and how does it become profane when people don't understand it? Those really became the symbols of the themes of this entire film.
Yeah, I love that icon and animation part so much, and I think it's so smart. Like, so there's this one part in the film where there's a small illustrated icon. Underneath it, there's like text on screen that kind of describes a different moment in history. It's between the bookends and unfortunate bookends of 9/11 and Oak Creek, and it's different. Each different animation or illustration and text is highlighting a different act of violence on somebody from the Sikh community in America, and it's really tragic, but it's really smart because those animations or those illustrations are kind of like, I don't mean this in like a pejorative way, but they're kind of cute, right? Or they're like illustrated, and there's a funness to them, but then contrasting that to like the reality of these terrible acts of violence, it disarms the audience, it disarms the viewer, it disarmed me a hell of a lot, right? So it was really smart. So I guess, how did you and maybe it was Mackenzie, or how did you land on this? What was the process? And just, I think it's really creative. So like talking to other filmmakers, if there's maybe lack of footage or lack of story, how do you find that kind of these creative solutions to really tell a story and tell it well?
Yeah. So Kenzie and I had so many conversations about this, because you're like wrapping your head around, how do I connect this story and keep it as tight as it needs to be? Because if you keep, we didn't have the luxury of going on a whim or going outside of what we had to cover that, because ultimately, what was the story about? And we kept coming back to that. Like, what is the story? The story is about how people are using Seva, but it's not being misunderstood. And how does that lead to being, victims in a hate crime, and ultimately coming full circle with how we serve our communities. And so when you're dealing with those kind of things, we're having conversations about, there were all sorts of conversations. It was like, how do we do this? Do we animate it fully? Do we spend the money? Do we go out of, like, how do we do this? Are we relying on more photos or different footage? But ultimately, when she did this version of it, I was like, yes, I think that's it, because you're saying it's a little bit lighthearted in its style, but it's minimalist in a way that forces you to read what is on screen. And as you see it happening, you realize, when I even read it, it was like, this is happening, and this is happening, and and it's constant. And I think there was just this huge wave, even after we had finished the film, where hate crimes were happening all the time, and they were just popping up left and right, and someone being just everywhere. And so this was our way of keeping it contained in the way that I think an audience could absorb it, while still going into what was, the biggest hate crime for this community in Oak Creek.
It's a really powerful tool, and it is very jarring, but it's also like honest. I guess not just the animation, but how do you hope this film like helps the Sikh community? How does it feel, and how do you hope that it affects in the South Asian, the brown community, or just different minority groups, different groups in America, like cope, heal, think, process hate?
This film means so much to me on so many different levels, especially with everything that's happening in this country, especially within, with the previous administration, and transitioning into really thinking about what our role is as a human, and what can we do to play a part in this collective. And so my biggest hope for this film is to get it to more people, because every time someone sees this film, we are talking about it. they are telling me, oh, I know that that's the brown experience, but look, I have a Black experience, and we are running in. We have a lot of parallels, of the pain and the trauma, or I'm from this community. And so my biggest hope is that it can get out there so we can have more conversations that we are having. And it has been incredible to have people send me information and say, look, I learned this from that film. I learned this from Seva. And now I see an article in the New York Times around Black Lives Matter and the Sikh community creating thousands of meals to give to protesters, and just this idea of how is this interwoven? How do we operate as human beings and work collectively to make a better place? So going back to that, I would love to have this film in places where people are having these types of conversations, in schools and educational spaces, because I think it does what I had intended for it to do, which was show the culture and show the religion. What is this thing about coming into communal halls and to be creating food? What does that look like? And how does that translate into everyday practice? If we are strangers walking down the street, what does that look like to help someone, And so that's my biggest hope, is just to get more eyes on it and more visibility, and to have these types of conversations.
Well, with that in mind, and we'll leave you with this, and we'll leave the audience with this, but how do people connect with you, connect with the film, in the sense to make it an activation within their communities, get people to see it? How can they know where is it screening next, or what is there any sort of distribution happening? Just how can people engage with the film and you, and so on and so forth?
So obviously the pandemic created a huge curveball in this entire release of the film, but we are so grateful to places like Social Justice Film Institute and Festival. So it has been at a number of festivals, and we are looking to get it into different schools potentially. But right now, what people can really do is support us by, we have a website. It's called Cinderella.com. It's a play on my last name. So it's SINDHERELLA.com, or on, all social media accounts, where we have some different action plans going on with how to get this in spaces. But we're also very open to people's suggestions about, what other platforms. And I'm looking into also different museums that might be of this, and be of this nature. And I'd love to do that.
I mean, everybody's looking for programming right now, virtual programming, digital programming. Let's go. Let's get this film out there.
Yes, let's do it. Let's do it.
All right. Well, we are at time. I just want to thank you so much, not only for making a dope film that I really wholeheartedly appreciate it, but just having this conversation with me and sharing kind of your process and insights, and just kind of being vulnerable for all of us. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for everything. And thank you to the team at Social Justice. If it wasn't for you guys, it's hard to be a filmmaker and get stories out there. So I really appreciate it.